Beloved, will you pray with me? God, with the sound of the rain on the roof, huddled together under this great umbrella of care, quiet our hearts, open us to all our feelings, open us to a sense of your presence, and help us to take our place in the long line of spiritual ancestors and descendants with the story and stories that keep repeating themselves, that allow us to know you and ourselves. Amen. So this is our last Sunday worshiping in the lovely warm space offered us by our friends at First Pres, our friends who called immediately when they caught wind, literally, of the fire happening, raging across the street at our church. Next Sunday, we'll start our second chapter of our sojourn in the wilderness as we begin worshiping in the morning again at the time that has muscle memory for us at another community of faith while our own sanctuary is getting rebuilt. Not in 3 days, as Jesus said, but Mo Wright says maybe 3 months, which sounds pretty good to me. It's been so important these last few weeks to be close to the place we think of as our church home. So many of us, we say and we believe that the church is the people and not the building, but the building is not nothing. We have in fact been using our hobbled campus to still be church in so many ways, right? Last week we were making sandwiches for the homeless on the front lawn. We were running youth group on the plaza. We were plotting the mental health revolution in the chapel. We were offering pastoral care and counseling in the smoky hall of entrance and using tiny Durant House as a MASH unit office for all 18-ish of the staff. We have gotten even closer in the last 2 weeks. It's been important to huddle close to this hearth, even if that hearth became a smoking wreck, not just because of the ways in which we can still be church on our own property, but because the building that burned houses so many memories for so many people. We weren't ready to leave it behind yet. And from here we can literally look out the clear paned windows and feel all those feelings. Feel that joy of what was and the stab of what is no more. We can feel what it is to have lost what we have lost. The place where our wedding reception was, or our premarital counseling, where we got our feet washed on Maundy Thursday, or danced our tookuses off at the winter ball, annual meetings, godly play stories seated on the rug, laughter at staff meeting, tears and spiritual breakthroughs in pastors' offices. Berkeley's nursery, in which for decades so many of our church children have felt safe and loved by a God who for an hour and a half each week wears Berkeley's skin. It's all lost. And there is a delicious kind of pain in pressing that bruise and being right next to the loss, being present to that empty space that reminds us of what's gone. It surprised me how many of my friends and family in the first few weeks after the fire made reference to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They didn't do it to be cruel. They did it to try to give us hope, as if we were in danger of not having any. They did it to remind us that when the temple was destroyed, it transformed the religious practice of our Jewish siblings so that their experience of God was not confined to one holy place, but it was clear that God would travel with them everywhere they went. We didn't necessarily need that reminder. That first week, that first day after the fire, we were already making jokes. And the second week, we were introspective, we were making meaning and making plans. There was no false cheer or fake positivity to this humor and hope. They were real. They are real. The mark of spiritually mature people who trust in the Lord and have been through a lot. But here's the thing. There's still grief. And that has to come out as well. This week, a number of us finally began to experience that post-adrenaline hangover. That feeling of trauma finally allowing itself to rise to the surface. And we began to reflect a little more on what we'd lost and to let ourselves feel that loss in our bones. God doesn't ask us to be only brave, only accepting in the face of loss, perfect paragons of Buddhist equanimity. God understands that we need to rage and keen and cry sometimes. If we deny these feelings, if we hide them in our shadow, they will find their way out, and usually in more toxic ways. And they will hold us back from healing and really being able to move on. One of the hardest things about being human is how fragile life feels sometimes. How sometimes it feels like everything we love and everyone we love is on the verge of falling apart, and we're helpless to hold them together. As Bishop Anne Lamott, as I like to call her, once wrote, life is a precious, unfathomably beautiful gift, and it is impossible here on the incarnational side of things. It's been a very bad match for those of us who are born extremely sensitive. It is so hard and so weird sometimes that we have to wonder if we're being punked. I was glad of my friend's reminder about the destruction of the Second Temple, because with it comes along the prophetic little moment next to Jesus that Sonny just read for us. Jesus has actually just finished his little rage fest in the temple, turning over the tables of the moneylenders, when he comes out and makes this double entendre about the temple's fate and his own fate, his death. He was probably on his own adrenaline hangover when he said these words, when he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The temple he was talking about, by the way, it had been built 4 centuries earlier. It was the Second Temple, and then Herod, the king, had spent 46 years enlarging it, renovating it, putting his own stamp on it. It was one of the most ambitious and magnificent structures that civilization had ever seen. And at the time Jesus said what he said, there were still 30 years to go before it was completed. They should have hired Mo Wright. And only 7 years after it was done, 7 years after 86 years of work, 400 years, the Romans destroyed it, and it was never rebuilt. Today, all that remains is the wall we know as the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, the place where pilgrims, especially Jewish pilgrims, still gather from all over the world to pray and to grieve what has passed away. I wonder if anyone who stood watching the Romans tear down that temple 40 years later remembered what Jesus had said. I wonder what it's like to see something you've worked on for 86 years turn into rubble in a matter of weeks. Jesus is reminding us that all life is ephemeral, that everything we build is going to die. And then Jesus says, "Don't worry, destroy this temple, 3 days, bam, brand new." He makes it all sound so easy, like there's never a reason for grief. Sometimes I think we Christians do a disservice when we preach resurrection so glibly. We gloss over how hard the death and loss part really is. Remember, Genesis said that God made the world in 7 days. But the Hebrew word we translate day actually means an unspecified period of time. So if you consider that the universe is 14 billion years old, that means a day is 2 billion years. And all of a sudden, Jesus' 3 days are 6 billion years away. That's how hard resurrection feels sometimes. That it's going to take 6 billion years for this thing to come alive again. Earlier this week at staff meeting, we were reflecting on how for lots of us right now, it just feels like too much, just too much. I know I've had a month. When it started, 2 of my sisters were in full-blown mental health crises. Then Peter went away to the Galapagos. I blessed that trip, but then the next day, all 3 of us, me and the kids, got horribly sick. I was sick for 2 weeks. And then my church burned down 5 months after I started my new job. And I thought I was doing okay until I had to go to the California Department of Motor Vehicles this week for the 3rd time to get my license. And I missed my place in line, and I had to start from the beginning, and that made me late for my first pastor-parish relations committee meeting. I sat there in the middle of the mess at the DMV, and I started to cry in public. Some of you have had a month. Say amen if you've had a month. Some of you have lost not just a place that's precious to you, your safe and sacred space. You have lost sacred friends. You've lost Shirley Henderson and Natalie Lucchese. Their lights have gone out of this world. And you might be wondering who's next as death pilfers your friends one by one. And underneath all that's happening in our personal lives, there is the horrific psychic stress of the presidential election. This week, 3 different people came to me because of Trump's behavior and victim blaming, because what he was saying and what he had done fused in their minds with the trauma they had suffered as children or adults, and all the hard work, the hard soul work they've been doing for decades felt torn down in a moment, left as rubble, the safe sanctuary they had built for themselves around their knees. Now, I know that most of us are too wise and theologically astute to blame God for our troubles, but let's be honest. Sometimes we want a scapegoat. And God can handle anything we dish out. There is a long and sacred tradition of crying out to God in sorrow and in anger. It's called the book of Job. It's called the Psalms. We are not bad people if we join our voices with theirs, if we know we need to keen. Some of you might be okay. You might be getting by. And if you are today, I want to ask you to hold a little space for the person down the pew for you who is barely holding it together, who really needs to cry out to God, who really needs to make a lament. And I want to give you permission right here and right now in this safe space to let it out, to make your own wailing wall right here next to the rubble. Even if you don't really believe that it's God's fault, that God controls every little thing. Even if you sometimes doubt that God exists because of the ground conditions here. Even if you're angry at the God you don't believe in. Cry out, lament. People join me in saying, God, how could you? God, how could you let a man capture the imagination, a man like that, capture the imagination of a third of the electorate. How could you let him have so much power and wealth and access? How could you let him hurt girls and vulnerable women like that? How could you let anyone take advantage, sexual or emotional or physical, of another child of God? God, how could you let our church burn when we had such big plans, when we were already working so hard? God, how could you let gentle and loving people whom we love, suffer from terrible depression and anxiety? God, how could you? You try it. Speak up. God, how could you? Speak up. God, how can you let black and brown, vulnerable, young and older people be gunned down unarmed in our cities by those who should be protecting them? God, how could you? It's okay to cry out your lament, as personal as it is. We will hold it, and we will hold it in confidence. God, how could you? This is your moment. Yes. Yes. God, how could you let my friend Max die at age 44 of lung cancer this week, with children now orphaned? God, how could you let so many people who work so hard still not be able to make the rent? And then, into the silence, into the emptiness, God draws near to us. God says, I know. Shh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm not responsible for this, but I'm so sorry. It's happening and I'm weeping too. Be good to each other. That's how you'll know I'm real and alive. Resurrection might feel like it's taking 6 billion years to get finished, but God says, I'm starting right now. I'm starting right now. Because resurrection's starting when, after church, a motley group of teenagers, black and brown and white, adopted and bio, cis and trans, jock and geek, gather on the steps of their church to eat entirely too many M&Ms and talk about their stress and pray about the election, as I was privileged to do with our youth last Sunday. Resurrection is starting when Natalie Lucchese signed her last legal documents, raised her hands to heaven, said, Shakur, Shakur, I'm ready. And let God welcome her home. She showed us how to live, and then she showed us how to die and live forever. Resurrection is starting when, in answer to the pout and snarl at the second unpresidential debate, women everywhere afterward drank wine or chamomile tea and then regrouped and took to Twitter and Facebook and to their own divided or ignorant families, ignorant in the sense of not knowing, to tell their own stories of sexual assault and harassment and abuse, and to begin to let the light shine into every dark corner. And as with the anti-racism movement, they are exposing the violence that has been there all along so that we can end it forever. And resurrection is starting when, on an almost empty stage, facing the ashes of a burned building, 2 beautiful people climb the steps to say yes to God in baptism, as Derek and Brielle are about to do. And then 13 more beautiful people take those steps to fill the empty spaces between and around Derek and Brielle and not leave them alone, to make their own promises to be faithful members of this Church of Jesus Christ, even in the middle of the mess and the rubble, indeed coming because it's a mess, it's a holy mess, because they want to be part of something that's unfinished, a temple in progress and on the move, because they've found a people as imperfect and undone as they are, and a place where they are so clearly needed for the work that's ahead.